Right now, as you are watching this video, the United States and Iran are locked in the most dangerous military standoff the world has seen in decades. And the number at the center of all of it is 440 kilograms. That is the size of Iran's stockpile of uranium enriched to 60% purity. And according to nuclear experts and the Center for Strategic and International Studies, that stockpile alone is enough raw material to produce approximately 12 nuclear bombs. 12. And here is the part that should make every single American sit down and pay very close attention. The United States bombed Iran's nuclear facilities in June of 2025, launched strikes again in February of 2026, and as of right now, today, April 11th, 2026, the American military and intelligence community still cannot fully confirm where all of that uranium is. The bombs fell, the facilities were damaged, but the uranium, that 440 kilograms that could end cities, may have been moved before the strikes even began. That is the world we are living in right now. That is the story unfolding in real time, and you deserve to understand every single layer of it. Numerous reports indicate that President Trump is considering deploying U.S. troops to seize or destroy Iran's stockpile of 440.9 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium. Let that sink in for just a moment. We are not talking about a theoretical threat somewhere in the distant future. We are talking about a present-day military crisis in which American soldiers could potentially be sent to physically grab hundreds of kilograms of near-weapons-grade uranium from a country that just had its supreme leader killed, its nuclear facilities bombed, and its military infrastructure shattered, and is still firing back, still launching drones and missiles, still closing the Strait of Hormuz, still fighting. So let's start at the very beginning, because this story did not begin in February of 2026. It did not even begin in June of 2025. This story has been building for decades, layer upon layer, decision upon decision. And if you want to understand where we are right now, you have to understand how we got here. You have to go back in time, not all the way, but far enough to see the pattern. Iran's nuclear negotiations with the United States and the international community have been a central geopolitical drama for years. Iranian officials claim that their nuclear program is for civilian purposes, but most observers think the country seeks capabilities to develop a nuclear weapon and enriches and stockpiles uranium beyond civilian needs. That tension, Iran saying one thing and the world observing another, has been the fundamental fault line running through every negotiation, every sanction, every threat, and every airstrike for the better part of 20 years. And the reason it matters so profoundly to Americans is because the United States has never been a passive observer in this story. It has been one of the central actors. When Donald Trump pulled the United States out of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, back in 2018 during his first term, he did something that changed the entire trajectory of this crisis. He removed the guardrails. He believed, and his team believed, that maximum pressure, crushing sanctions, economic isolation, military threats, would force Iran to the table on American terms. What actually happened is more complicated than that, and far more dangerous. International scrutiny of Iran's nuclear and missile programs intensified in 2018 after the United States withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, and again in late 2024, following direct military strikes between Iran and Israel, as well as the re-election of Donald Trump. And in the years that followed that withdrawal, Iran didn't slow down its nuclear program. It accelerated it. By late 2024, the trajectory had become impossible to ignore. In December 2024, IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi told Reuters that Tehran was dramatically ramping up uranium enrichment to up to 60%, close to the roughly 90% weapons-grade threshold. That number, 60%, is not a casual detail. 90% is what you need for a weapon. 60% gets you most of the way there. And Iran at that point was producing it faster than at any time in its history, building a stockpile that kept growing month after month, even as diplomats flew around the world trying to find some agreement to stop it. By February 2025, U.S. intelligence indicated that a covert team of scientists in Iran was orchestrating a faster, though cruder, approach to creating an atomic weapon. So right there, in the early months of Trump's second term, American intelligence agencies are watching a covert Iranian weapons team at work. And yet the Trump administration was simultaneously pursuing direct negotiations with Tehran, the first direct talks since the JCPOA withdrawal, trying to thread an almost impossible needle between diplomacy and deterrence. On March 2nd, U.S. Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff revealed that Iran began recent nuclear talks by insisting on its inalienable right to enrich uranium, rejecting a U.S. proposal for zero enrichment, and boasting that its 460 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium could produce 11 nuclear bombs. Now, some diplomats who were in the room pushed back on Witkoff's characterization. They said he misread the exchange, that Iran had actually floated the idea of suspending enrichment for several years as a confidence-building measure. But whether Iran was genuinely offering a concession or simply posturing, the public revelation that Iran was sitting on enough uranium for over a dozen bombs and knew it and was willing to say it out loud in a negotiating room changed the temperature of the entire conversation dramatically. On February 20th, President Trump gave Iran a 10-day deadline to reach a deal, or else the United States would attack Iran. 10 days. That is the kind of ultimatum that either produces a breakthrough or produces a war. And in this case, while there were moments that seemed like progress, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi stated that a historic agreement with the United States to avert military conflict was within reach ahead of renewed talks in Geneva. Those hopeful signals ultimately gave way to something much darker. Because here is where the story takes a turn that you really need to understand. While diplomats were talking, while envoys were flying, while foreign ministers were issuing carefully worded statements about progress and historic opportunities, things were simultaneously moving on a very different track. By February 19th, the U.S. military buildup in the Middle East was described as the largest in the region since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Let that sit with you for a second. The largest military buildup since the invasion of Iraq, while talks were supposedly still alive. That is the kind of parallel reality that defines how great powers move toward war, even when they claim to be pursuing peace. And then it happened. The United States and Israel launched coordinated military operations against the Iranian regime on February 28, 2026. The action, focused on the regime's nuclear facilities, military infrastructure, and leadership, followed a conclusion reached in Washington and Jerusalem that diplomacy had been exhausted, the strikes were massive, they were coordinated. And among the targets was the man who had led Iran for decades, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei himself. Large-scale strikes targeted Iranian military assets and the Islamic Republic's top leadership, killing Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. This was not just a strike on buildings and centrifuges. This was regime decapitation. This was the United States and Israel together killing the leader of a sovereign nation, a nation of 87 million people, while publicly saying they were engaged in targeted military operations, not a war. But of course, Iran responded. Iran responded with missile and drone strikes against Israel, U.S. bases, and U.S. allies in the Middle East, and by closing the Strait of Hormuz, disrupting global trade. The Strait of Hormuz. Think about what that means for a moment. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through that narrow waterway. When Iran closed it, energy markets convulsed. Gas prices spiked. Global shipping routes scrambled. The economic shockwaves reached every corner of the planet, including every American kitchen table. Iran launched hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles at Israel and at U.S. military bases in Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Iran and its proxies launched strikes on Iraq's Kurdistan. A drone struck Britain's Akrotiri military base on Cyprus, and missiles were shot down over Turkey. This was no longer a contained regional skirmish. This was a multi-theater conflict with American service members in the crosshairs across a half-dozen countries simultaneously. And the American public, by and large, was watching it unfold on their phones and televisions with a kind of stunned disbelief, because this is not what most people expected when they went to sleep in late February of 2026. Now let's talk about the nuclear question specifically, because this is where the story gets almost unbearably tense. Back in June of 2025, when the U.S. first struck Iran's nuclear facilities as part of what was called Operation Midnight Hammer, the stated goal was to destroy Iran's ability to enrich uranium and eliminate its stockpile. The Fordo uranium enrichment plant, the Natanz nuclear facility, and the Isfahan Nuclear Technology Center were targeted with 14 GBU-57A B-MOP bunker buster bombs carried by B-2 Spirit stealth bombers and Tomahawk missiles fired from a submarine. These are the most powerful conventional weapons the United States military possesses. The bunker busters are specifically designed to penetrate deeply buried, heavily reinforced underground facilities, and Fordow, in particular, is buried 80 to 90 meters underground, deeper than almost any other nuclear site in the world. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth declared that Iran's nuclear ambitions had been obliterated, but the classified intelligence assessment told a very different story. An initial assessment indicated that the strikes damaged above-ground structures and sealed the entrances to 2 targets, but did not destroy the associated underground facilities and the centrifuges required to produce enriched uranium for a nuclear weapon. The report concluded that the United States had not destroyed Iran's nuclear program, but delayed it a few months. A few months. Not years, not permanently. A few months. And then, this is the part that should genuinely alarm you. Vance and other U.S. officials conceded that they did not know where Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium was, and that it had likely been moved away from Fordow before the strikes. This is the central nightmare of the entire situation. The United States launched the most powerful conventional military strikes it has ever conducted against an adversary's nuclear program, and afterward, senior American officials admitted they didn't know where the uranium was. The whole point of the strikes, from a non-proliferation standpoint, was to destroy or seize that stockpile. And Iran appears to have anticipated the strikes and moved the material. Where? That is the question that keeps nuclear security experts awake at night right now. Although the International Atomic Energy Agency has not been given access to Iran's bombed sites to confirm what portion of the 60% stockpile survived the June 2025 strikes, or where all the material is located, Director General Rafael Grossi said on March 9th that the agency assesses that little over 200 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium is underground at Isfahan. 200 kilograms. Accounted for. That still leaves hundreds of kilograms potentially unaccounted for. Material that, in the right hands, with the right expertise, could be further enriched to weapons grade in a matter of weeks. Iran still retains hundreds of kilograms of the core component needed to build a bomb, as well as decades of expertise. As the U.S. and Israel look to wind down the war, they are determined to target that expertise in a bid to cripple the nuclear program. And that is a deeply troubling sentence, because what it actually means is that the United States recognizes that bombing buildings and centrifuges is not enough. The knowledge is in human heads. The expertise is distributed across university departments, research institutes, a generation of trained nuclear scientists. You cannot bomb an idea. You cannot destroy a skill set with a bunker buster. Experts say that even if Iran's program is peaceful, Tehran has the architecture to weaponize it should it choose to. Iran can still create a nuclear weapon. It's just a matter of political will. Read that sentence again. After all the strikes, after all the bombs, after all the destruction, Iran can still build a nuclear weapon if it decides to. That is the expert assessment as of right now, today, in April of 2026. The military campaign may have set the program back by months, possibly longer, but it has not eliminated the threat. And in some ways, and this is the deeply ironic, deeply troubling part, it may have made the threat more likely to materialize, not less. Because a country that has just been bombed, that has had its leader assassinated, that has had its military infrastructure shattered, that has watched the world watch all of this happen, that country now has every strategic incentive to pursue the one thing that would guarantee it could never be bombed again: a nuclear deterrent. As a result of the war, Iran may emerge more determined than ever to acquire a nuclear weapon to deter future conflict. The Ayatollah presumably prefers the fate of Kim Jong-un to that of Muammar Gaddafi. That is the calculus that Iranian leadership is running right now. Kim Jong-un built a bomb and nobody touches North Korea. Muammar Gaddafi gave up his weapons program and ended up dead in a ditch. That lesson has not been lost on any government in the world that watches what happens to leaders who disarm. After 40 days of sustained combat, a ceasefire took effect on April 8, 2026, marking the end of a major joint campaign aimed at degrading Iran's military capabilities, countering its nuclear and ballistic missile programs, and reshaping the regional security landscape. So as of 3 days ago, 3 days before you are watching this video, a ceasefire came into effect. The shooting has paused. But the fundamental problem has not been solved. The uranium is still out there. The knowledge is still there. The grievances on both sides are now deeper and more raw than they have ever been. and the world is left trying to figure out what comes next. The World Trade Organization said that if oil and gas prices remain high for the rest of the year, it could reduce the forecasted 2026 growth in global GDP by 0.3%, with Europe potentially seeing GDP grow at least 1% less than previously expected. That is the economic reality landing on ordinary families, not just in Iran, not just in the Middle East, but here, in America, in Europe, in every country whose economy is woven into the global trading system that depends on oil flowing through the Persian Gulf. At the end of the conflict, Iran will retain the nuclear expertise and likely key materials necessary for building a nuclear bomb. But not only are strikes ineffective in addressing proliferation risks in the long term, the ongoing military action and Trump's threats to deploy U.S. troops to seize Iran's enriched uranium is creating a new set of nuclear risks and safety hazards. That is the Arms Control Association speaking. That is not a fringe view. That is the considered judgment of serious people who have spent their careers studying nuclear security. The war may be entering a ceasefire phase, but the nuclear problem, the real nuclear problem, is arguably more complicated now than it was before the first bomb fell. What Americans need to grapple with, what this country needs to have an honest conversation about, is whether the approach taken over the past year has made us safer or whether it has simply reordered the danger. The uranium is still there. The expertise is still there. The motivation to build a weapon, if anything, has intensified. And the United States has now demonstrated to the entire world, including to countries like North Korea and China, who are watching every move very carefully, exactly how it responds when it believes a country is approaching nuclear capability. The question every serious strategist is now asking is, what does the next chapter look like? Because the ceasefire is not the end of this story. It may not even be the end of this chapter.